The night the human girl was forced to dance for the wolves, the Alpha King forgot how to breathe. Elowen Vale stood barefoot in the center of Silverglass Hall while 300 royal wolves laughed behind their jeweled masks. Above her, moonlight poured through the glass ceiling in long silver blades, turning the marble floor into a frozen lake. Around her, nobles in black velvet and white fur whispered the word human as if it were an insult too dirty to speak aloud. Lady Seraphine Crow smiled from the steps of the throne, beautiful, cruel, and certain she had already won the crown. "Dance, servant," she said, her voice sweet enough to poison wine. "Show His Majesty how humans entertain themselves before they are sent back to the kitchens." A ripple of laughter moved through the court. Elowen felt it strike her shoulders, her throat, the hollow place in her chest where fear lived. She could have refused. She could have run. But then she heard the sound no one else seemed to hear. A small, broken whimper near the royal dais. Prince Riven, the Alpha King's young brother, was curled beside the black stone steps with his hands pressed over his ears, shaking beneath the weight of the drums. The court called him cursed. The healers called him unreachable. Elowen had seen him once in the corridor, hiding from his own guards like a child afraid of his shadow. So she lifted her chin. If they wanted a spectacle, she would give them something they could not understand. The musician struck a harsh northern rhythm, sharp enough to command soldiers. Elowen ignored it. She closed her eyes and listened instead to the tiny silver bell tied beneath her sleeve, the last thing her mother had left her. It rang once, though no hand touched it. Her feet moved, not fast, not pretty in the way the court expected. Her first step was soft, almost a prayer. The second turned her away from the throne. The third changed the air. The laughter thinned. The drums faltered. Elowen moved as if she were walking out of every room that had ever made her feel small. Her arms swept through the moonlight like she was opening invisible doors. Her body did not beg to be admired. It remembered freedom. It remembered a mother humming beside a window. It remembered fields beyond the citadel walls, where no one cared whether she had claws or a wolf or a name worth keeping. Prince Riven lowered one hand from his ear, then the other. His breathing steadied. Across the hall, King Lucian Veyr rose from his throne. The music died before anyone ordered it to stop. Fires along the walls sank low and blue. Every guard lowered his eyes. Lucian stared at Elowen as if the world had narrowed to the space between her heartbeat and his. His golden eyes darkened, then burned. Elowen spun beneath the moon, and a pale crescent mark flared to life on her wrist. The court went silent. Seraphine stopped smiling. The Alpha King gripped the carved arm of his throne until stone cracked beneath his hand, and from somewhere deep in his chest came a growl that shook every window in Silverglass Hall. One word fell from his lips, rough with disbelief and hunger and fear.
Mate.
For one impossible second, no one in Silverglass Hall moved. Elowen stood beneath the moonlight with her wrist burning like a secret trying to escape her skin, and every wolf in the royal court stared at her as if the servant girl had turned into a blade pointed at the throne. She did not understand the word that had left King Lucian Veyr's mouth, not fully. May was something wolves whispered about with reverence, something sacred, dangerous, and forever. It was not a word meant for a human girl who slept beside the laundry hearth and ate whatever the cooks were too tired to throw away. Elowen pulled her sleeve over the glowing mark, but it was too late. Lady Seraphine's face had gone pale beneath her perfect mask. Prince Riven was no longer trembling. He was watching Elowen with wide silver eyes, calm for the first time all evening. Lucian took one step down from the dais. The sound of his boot against marble echoed through the hall like a judgment bell. Elowen stepped back. Her heel touched cold stone, and memory opened beneath her like a trapdoor. That morning, she had woken before sunrise in the servants' wing, where frost crawled along the windows and the beds were lined so tightly that every girl learned to dream without moving. She had scrubbed soot from the west stairwell, polished 200 silver goblets, and carried baskets of black roses through corridors where nobles looked straight through her. In Noctharrow, humans were useful only when they were silent. They poured wine, mended hems, lit fires, and disappeared before wolves had to remember they existed. Elowen had become very good at disappearing. She kept her head low, her voice soft, and her strange little silver bell hidden beneath her sleeve. Her mother had tied it there years ago, with shaking fingers and one command: never dance where wolves can see you. Elowen had never understood why. Her mother had been a laundress with tired hands and songs older than church bells. She had taught Elowen steps in secret on a kitchen floor dusted with flour, moving slowly through moonlit patterns while whispering, "This is not for beauty, little star. This is for remembering who you are when the world renames you." After her mother died, Elowen stopped dancing. She stopped asking questions too. Questions made people suspicious, and suspicion was dangerous for a human girl without family, pack, or protection. But that morning, before the masquerade, Lord Aldrin Morcant had crossed her path outside the Old Moon Archive. His eyes had dropped to the bell under her sleeve, and for the first time, someone powerful had looked at her not with disgust, but with fear. He had grabbed her wrist only long enough to see the silver thread. Then his voice had gone thin. "Where did you get that?" Elowen had pulled away and lied. "From a junk drawer, my lord." His smile had been worse than anger. By sunset, Lady Seraphine had chosen Elowen to serve inside Silverglass Hall, and by moonrise, she had been pushed into the center of it. Now Lucian was coming closer, his golden eyes fixed on the sleeve hiding her mark. Elowen's heart pounded, but she did not kneel. She did not beg. She lifted her chin as the court waited to see if the human girl would break. Then Lord Aldrin's voice cut through the silence from the council balcony. "Your Majesty, step away from her. That mark belongs to a bloodline your father ordered erased." The moment Lord Aldrin spoke, every candle in Silverglass Hall bent away from King Lucian, as if even fire knew to fear what was waking inside him. Elowen felt the change before she understood it. The air grew heavy, not hot, not cold, but charged with something ancient enough to make the marble beneath her feet seem alive. Wolves who had laughed at her minutes ago lowered their eyes. Guards who had stood like iron statues shifted back half a step. Even Lady Seraphine stopped breathing through her perfect smile. Lucian did not look at Aldrin first. He looked at Elowen. Not at the torn hem of her servant dress, not at her bare feet, not at the sleeve she had pulled over the glowing mark. He looked into her eyes as if he had found a door in a wall he had spent his whole life bleeding against. Elowen should have been terrified. Part of her was. This was the Alpha King of Noctharrow, the ruler mothers used in warnings, the man whose wolf had silenced border wars with one appearance on a battlefield. Yet his expression was not cruel. It was controlled so tightly that control itself seemed painful. "Your Majesty," Lord Aldrin said again from the balcony, his voice smoother now, designed for witnesses. "The girl is dangerous. If that mark is real, she carries treason in her blood." Lucian finally turned his head. The movement was small, but the court reacted as if a sword had been drawn. "Treason," Lucian repeated. His voice was low enough to make every window tremble. "Against whom?" "Against the crown," Aldrin answered. "Against your house. Against the peace your father purchased." Elowen's hand closed around the silver bell under her sleeve. Peace. The word tasted bitter, though she did not know why. She remembered her mother locking the door on storm nights. She remembered songs cut short when wolf patrols passed the alley. She remembered being told never to answer if anyone asked whether she dreamed of the moon. Lucian stepped off the last stair of the dais, placing himself between Elowen and the council balcony. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was worse. It was instinct. Protective, immediate, absolute. The court saw it. Elowen saw it. Seraphine saw it too, and hatred flashed behind her. Jeweled mask. "She is a human servant," Seraphine said, her voice trembling just enough to betray her. "She performed a trick. Surely the king is not moved by kitchen superstition." Prince Riven, still seated near the throne, whispered. She made the noise stop. The silence that followed was different. Softer. Uneasy. Elowen looked at the boy, and something in her chest tightened. He was clutching a black ribbon that had been wrapped around his wrist, the kind used by healers to mark a cursed patient. She had not danced for power. She had danced because a child was suffering and no one else cared enough to notice. Lucian followed her gaze, and the gold in his eyes shifted, less wild now, more wounded. "You calmed him," he said to her. Elowen swallowed. "I only changed the rhythm." "No," Lucian said. His wolf pressed behind the word like thunder behind a door. "You answered him." Aldrin struck his cane against the balcony floor. "Enough. Remove the girl before the court mistakes contamination for destiny." 2 guards moved toward Elowen. They did not get within 6 feet. Lucian's growl rolled through the hall, and both men froze with their hands open at their sides. "Touch her," Lucian said quietly, "and you will answer to your king." Elowen's breath caught. No one had ever stood between her and harm before. No one had ever made her safety sound like law. Then the silver bell under her sleeve rang again by itself, clear and bright. The crescent mark on her wrist burned through the fabric. Across the hall, the sealed doors of the Forbidden Moon archive unlocked with a sound like 100 old bones remembering their names. Lord Aldrin went white, and Lucian turned toward those doors as a voice older than the kingdom whispered through the glass ceiling. "The last moon mirror has returned." The Forbidden Moon archive opened by itself, and the sound stole the breath from every wolf in Silverglass Hall. Elowen stared at the black doors as moonlight spilled through the crack between them, pale and cold, spreading across the floor until it touched her bare feet. She should have run. Every lesson life had beaten into her said that when powerful people grew afraid, powerless people paid the price. But Prince Riven made a small sound behind her, and Elowen turned back. The boy had curled into himself again, trembling as the old voice in the ceiling faded into silence. No one moved to comfort him. The nobles were too busy whispering Moonmere like it was a curse. The healers looked away. Even Seraphine took one step back, as if the child's pain might stain her gown. Elowen forgot the court. She forgot the Alpha King. She crossed the marble and knelt several feet from Riven, careful not to crowd him. "I know the noise hurts," she said softly. "I can make it quieter, but you have to look at my hand, not their faces." Riven's silver eyes lifted to hers. Elowen raised her wrist, the crescent mark glowing beneath the thin fabric of her sleeve, and tapped one slow rhythm against the floor. Once, twice, 3 times. Not a dance now, only the bones of one. The same rhythm her mother had used when storms shook the windows of their little room. Riven breathed with it. In, out, in. The court watched a human servant do what 12 royal healers had failed to do. Lucian watched without blinking, and something in his face changed. The king who had made armies kneel looked almost undone by the sight of one girl choosing gentleness when everyone expected fear. Elowen felt his attention like warmth at her back. It frightened her more than the laughter had. Not because it was cruel, but because it saw too much. When Riven's trembling eased, she rose and turned. Lucian stood only a few steps away. Up close, he seemed less like a king from a throne and more like a storm holding itself in the shape of a man. His jaw was tight. His hands were open at his sides, as if he was afraid closing them would break something. "Come with me to the archive," he said. His voice was quiet, but the hall bent around it. Elowen lifted her chin. "Am I being arrested?" A few nobles gasped at her tone. Lucian's gold eyes locked on hers. "No." Then commanded. "No." Claimed. The word slipped out before she could stop it, sharp with every fear she had carried since the moment he said mate. The silence turned fragile. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. His wolf moved behind his eyes, bright and restless, but he did not step closer. "I have the power to command every wolf in this room," he said. "I do not have the right to command you." Elowen's heart stumbled. She wanted to distrust him. It would have been safer. But Prince Riven's small hand caught the edge of her skirt, and the boy whispered, "Please do not leave." That was what made her decide. Not the king. Not the glowing mark. Not the court waiting to see her break. Elowen looked at Lucian and said, "I will go to the archive. But if anyone locks the door behind me, I will never dance for this kingdom again." For the first time that night, something like respect softened the Alpha King's face. "Agreed." He turned toward the open doors, and the crowd parted instantly. Elowen followed, with Riven's hand in hers and Lucian walking beside them like a shield made of shadow and crown. Behind them, Lady Seraphine's smile returned, thin and deadly. As the archive doors began to close, she leaned toward Lord Aldrin and whispered, "If the human girl remembers who she is, kill the proof before the king does." The moon archive did not smell like dust. It smelled like rain trapped inside stone, like old paper, cold iron, and secrets that had waited too long to be opened. Elowen stepped past the threshold with Prince Riven's hand still clutching her skirt, and every lantern along the circular walls lit by itself, one after another, rising in pale blue fire. Shelves climbed higher than castle towers, filled with silver-bound books, glass tablets, sealed scrolls, and moonstone boxes carved with names no one in Noctharrow had spoken for generations. Behind her, the doors shut softly, not like a prison, but like a warning. Lucian stayed near enough to protect her, far enough not to trap her. That distance said more than any promise. Elowen noticed it, and hated how badly she wanted to trust him for it. In the center of the room stood a round black table marked with the same crescent that burned beneath her sleeve. When Elowen moved closer, the mark on her wrist pulsed. The table answered. Thin lines of silver light spread across the stone, forming a map of the kingdom, then narrowing to one forgotten valley. Beyond the Frostvale woods, Riven whispered, Moonveil. Lucian went still. That name was buried before I was born. Elowen looked at him. Then, why does it know me? Before Lucian could answer, a book slid from the highest shelf and landed open on the table without a sound. Its pages turned by themselves until they stopped on a drawing of a woman dancing under a broken moon. Elowen's breath caught. The woman wore the same silver bell tied beneath her sleeve. The same crescent mark glowed on her wrist. Beneath the drawing, words formed slowly, in dark ink. When the last daughter dances, the sleeping wolf remembers. Elowen shook her head. I am not a wolf. I am human. The room answered her with a low, gentle hum. The pages turned again, revealing a family tree burned at the edges. One name had been scratched away so fiercely the paper had nearly torn. Lucian leaned over the table, his golden eyes narrowing. This record was altered. Someone removed the surviving child. Elowen touched the page, and the silver bell under her sleeve rang once. The scratched name reappeared in moonlight. Elowen Moonveil. Her knees weakened, but she did not fall. She gripped the table and forced herself to breathe. My mother was Vale, a laundress. She had no crown. Lucian's voice softened. Maybe she gave up a crown to keep you alive. Riven reached for a small moonstone box at the edge of the table. The moment his fingers touched it, a memory rose above the stone like mist. Elowen saw a woman with her mother's face running through snow, holding a bundled child while wolves in royal armor searched the valley below. She heard her mother's voice, younger, terrified, loving. Seal her wolf. Hide her scent. Let the world call her human until the king who is cursed learns how to choose without taking. The vision vanished. Elowen stared at Lucian, but he looked just as shaken as she felt. My father did this, he said, barely above a whisper. Or someone used his crown to do it. Before Elowen could speak, the archive floor trembled. The blue flames went dark. From outside the sealed doors came Lord Aldrin's calm voice, magnified by court magic. By order of the High Council, the human girl is to be contained before her blood wakes the curse. Lucian's eyes flashed gold, but Elowen raised her hand before he could move. On the black table, one final line appeared beneath her true name. If she leaves this room before moonrise, the false Luna will wear her crown. The warning on the archive table had barely finished glowing when the doors shook under the force of council magic. Prince Riven flinched, but Elowen pulled him gently behind her, placing herself between the child and the sealed entrance before Lucian could. The gesture was small, almost foolish against the power outside, yet it made the Alpha King go still. She was not a warrior. She had no claws, no fangs, no army kneeling to her name. But she had learned long ago that courage was not always loud. Sometimes courage was a servant girl standing barefoot in a forbidden room, refusing to let a frightened boy face the dark alone. Lucian stepped beside her, and the blue fire in the dead lanterns sparked back to life, as if his anger had given the room a pulse. "No council command outranks mine," he said. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Beyond the doors, Aldrin answered smoothly, "Your Majesty, the court has witnessed enough." The girl awakened a forbidden bloodline, entered a sealed royal chamber, and placed her hands on the prince. "By dawn, every border alpha will hear that you let a human witch stand between you and your throne." Elowen felt the words strike harder than a blade. Human witch. The old insult had found new teeth. Lucian moved toward the door, but Elowen caught his sleeve. Not because she had the right, not because she believed she could stop him, because she saw what Aldrin wanted. If Lucian tore through the council in front of the court, they would call him cursed. If he protected her with rage, they would call her the cause of it. She shook her head once. Lucian looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face. The bond between them pulled like a silver thread stretched too tight. "I can end this," he said. "You can," she whispered. "And they will use it to end you." Riven clutched her skirt. "Do not go." The words nearly broke her. Elowen knelt in front of him and untied the little silver bell from her wrist. The crescent mark still glowed beneath her skin, soft and stubborn. She placed the bell in his palm. "When the noise comes back, count 3 rings and breathe. You are not broken, Riven. You are listening to something they forgot how to hear." Tears brightened the boy's eyes, but he nodded. Lucian watched her with a pain so controlled it looked like stone. "You are planning to leave." Elowen rose slowly. "I am planning to keep them from using me as the knife they put to your kingdom's throat. I did not survive this long by mistaking a cage for shelter." His jaw tightened. "I will not command you to stay." "I know," she said, and that was the worst part. Because if he had ordered her, she could have hated him. Instead, he opened his hand. Inside his palm lay the moonstone box from the table, small enough to hide beneath her cloak. "Proof," he said. "Whatever they buried, this remembers. Take it. Trust no one who offers you safety too quickly." The archive doors opened before dawn under Lucian's command, not Aldrin's. The court waited outside in frozen silence. Seraphine stood near the front, dressed in white, already looking like a queen carved from ice. Elowen walked past them without bowing. No one laughed this time. Outside, snow fell over Moonveil Citadel, turning the world quiet and silver. At the lower gate, a servant pressed a travel cloak into her hands and pointed toward the old forest road. Elowen stepped beyond the wall with the moonstone box hidden against her heart. Behind her, the gate closed. Ahead, between the black trees, Lord Aldrin's riders emerged from the snow, and Seraphine's voice drifted from the shadows, sweet as poison. "The king let you choose freedom, little Luna. I choose what happens to you next." Seraphine's words had not finished fading before the forest road changed around Elowen. The snow stopped falling straight down and began circling her in a pale, unnatural spiral, hiding Moonveil Citadel behind a curtain of white. Riders in dark council cloaks spread between the trees, silent and disciplined, their wolves moving beneath their skin like shadows under ice. Elowen backed away slowly, one hand pressed over the moonstone box hidden beneath her cloak. She was afraid, but fear was an old room inside her. She knew where everything was kept. Seraphine stepped from the trees in her white gown, untouched by the storm, her smile sharp enough to make the cold feel warm. "You should have stayed in the kitchen," she said. "A servant can be ignored. A Luna cannot." Elowen lifted her chin. "Then perhaps you should stop calling me a servant." The smile vanished. Lord Aldrin emerged beside her, leaning on his black cane, eyes fixed on Elowen's wrist where the crescent mark glowed through her sleeve. "The archive gave you something," he said. "Hand it over, and I may let the court believe you ran away." Elowen looked past him and saw another figure half hidden behind the riders. The young servant who had given her the cloak stood with her hands bound in front of her, trembling but alive. Aldrin had used the girl as bait and proof that kindness could be turned into a trap. Elowen's heart hardened. "Let her go first." Seraphine laughed softly. Still pretending you have choices. Elowen did not answer. She lowered her eyes, not in submission, but to watch the snow beneath her feet. The old rhythm was there, buried under panic. One step to remember. One breath to endure. One turn to open what was sealed. Her mother's voice seemed to move with the wind. This is not for beauty, little star. This is for remembering. Elowen stepped left. The riders shifted closer. She stepped right. The crescent on her wrist brightened. Aldrin's expression changed. Stop her. Elowen spun. Not like she had in the hall, not soft for a frightened prince, but fierce and precise, each movement cutting a silver line through the snow. The moonstone box warmed against her heart. Ancient symbols flashed under the frozen road, hidden beneath 10 years of dirt and lies. The bound servant gasped as the ropes around her hands loosened and fell away, undone by light, not force. Run, Elowen said. The girl ran toward the citadel. One rider moved to stop her, but the ground between them rose in a wall of moonlit frost, high as a carriage and bright as glass. Elowen staggered, dizzy from the power, but she did not fall. She pulled the moonstone box free and opened it before Aldrin could reach her. A voice spilled into the storm, her mother's voice, recorded in moonstone. Lord Aldrin Morcant gave the order. He murdered the Moonveil line and blamed the crown. He sealed my daughter's wolf so the true mate bond would never wake. The forest went silent. Seraphine stared at Aldrin as if the truth had struck her too soon. Aldrin's calm mask cracked. Foolish girl, he whispered. You do not know what that proof will cost. The snow behind him exploded into silver mist. The citadel bells roared in the distance. 1 ring, then 3, then 9. Riven had used the bell. Lucian had heard. Every wolf in the forest dropped to one knee before the king appeared, because his power arrived before his body did. Then King Lucian Veyr stepped out of the storm with golden eyes burning, black cloak snapping behind him, and the royal guard spread at his back like a nightfall army. He did not look at Seraphine. He did not look at Aldrin. He looked only at Elowen, at the moonstone in her hand, at the servant girl standing alive behind the wall of frost. Pride and fury moved across his face, controlled by something deeper than rage. Elowen held up the proof with shaking fingers.
I did not run, she said.
I brought you the truth. Lucian's voice was quiet enough to terrify the trees.
I know.
Then he turned to Aldrin, and the storm seemed to kneel with him. You hunted a human girl through my forest. But you forced a queen to remember her name. The crescent on Elowen's wrist flared brighter than the moon above them, and from inside her chest, something wild finally opened its eyes. By the time Lucian brought Elowen back to Silverglass Hall, dawn had turned the glass ceiling pale with winter light, and the entire court had been summoned to witness what they once believed would be her punishment. The same marble floor where nobles had laughed at her bare feet now reflected the royal banners, the council seals, and the silent faces of every wolf who had called her weak. Elowen entered without chains, without a crown, and without hiding her wrist. The crescent mark shone through the room like a quiet answer. Behind her walked the servant girl she had saved, Prince Riven holding the little silver bell, and King Lucian Veyr, close enough to shield her but not so close that anyone could mistake her courage for his command. Lord Aldrin stood below the throne with 2 royal guards on either side, his black cane gone, his calm smile finally stripped away. Lady Seraphine stood near the altar steps in her white gown, no longer looking like a queen, only a woman terrified of losing a throne she had already imagined as hers. Lucian lifted the moonstone box for the court to see. The object looked small in his hand, but the silence around it was enormous. You were told this girl bewitched your king, he said. You were told her blood threatened Noctharrow. Today you will hear the voice of the woman your council erased. He opened the box. Elowen's mother filled the hall in silver light, not flesh, not ghost, but memory made undeniable. Her voice trembled, yet every word carried. Lord Aldrin Morcant ordered the fall of Moonveil. He sealed my daughter's wolf and hid her among humans. He feared that one day she would wake the true mate bond and end the false crown he built from lies. Gasps moved through the court like wind through dead leaves. The old nobles looked at Aldrin. The younger wolves looked at Elowen. Seraphine stepped forward, desperate. It is an illusion. A servant trick. A human trick. Riven raised the silver bell. She is not a trick, he said, his small voice clear enough to reach the balcony. She heard me when all of you called me cursed. That broke something in the room. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But Elowen felt it. The court was no longer looking down at her. They were looking at themselves. Aldrin tried one final time to speak, but the crescent mark on Elowen's wrist flared, and the sealed moon symbols above the hall awakened one by one. Silver light poured down over the marble, forming a circle around her. Elowen understood without being told. Her mother's rhythm was not only a dance.
It was testimony.
So she stepped forward. Once for the child she had protected. Twice for the mother who had hidden her. 3 times for the name they had tried to bury. The light rose with each movement, revealing hidden records across the walls, names of Moonveil heirs, forged decrees, and Aldrin's seal pressed into every lie. No sword was drawn. No scream was needed. Truth did what violence never could. It made the guilty stand naked before the people they had fooled. The guards lowered their heads and took Aldrin away. Seraphine reached for Lucian, but he stepped past her as if she were only smoke. Then, before the full court, the Alpha King of Noctharrow lowered himself to one knee in front of Elowen Vale, Elowen Moonveil, the human girl they had mocked. He did not touch her. He did not claim her. He simply bowed his head and held out his hand. "I will not choose for you," he said, his voice rough with everything he had been holding back. "But if you choose me, this kingdom will know its Luna was never found on a throne. She was found standing when everyone expected her to kneel." Elowen looked at the court, at the servants crying quietly near the doors, at Riven smiling through tears, and finally at the king waiting below her with all his power surrendered into patience. She reached for his hand, and the moment her fingers touched his, every wolf in Silverglass Hall bowed. The moment Elowen placed her hand in Lucian's, the mate bond did not snap shut like a cage. It opened like a door. Silver light swept through Silverglass Hall, rising from the marble floor, climbing the banners, touching every bowed head with the quiet force of a truth no one could laugh away anymore. Elowen felt Lucian's pulse through his palm, strong and unsteady, the heartbeat of a king who had faced armies without fear but trembled before a girl he refused to command. She had spent her life being moved from corner to corner, room to room, name to name, always small enough to be ignored. Now the whole kingdom waited for her voice. Lucian looked up at her from one knee, golden eyes fierce, patient, and full of a devotion he had not yet dared to speak. Elowen could feel his wolf through the bond, not as a monster, not as a threat, but as a lonely creature that had been chained in darkness too long and had recognized home in her first breath. She squeezed his hand. "I choose you," she said, and the words were soft, but they carried to the highest balcony. Not because the bond demands it, not because the court approves it. I choose you because when you had the power to take, you waited. Lucian rose slowly, and the room seemed to rise with him. He did not pull her into display. He simply turned to the court with her hand still resting in his, equal, visible, undeniable.
"Then hear your Luna," he said.
A murmur rolled through the hall. Not rebellion, not fear, but awe. Prince Riven ran to Elowen and wrapped both arms around her waist. The little silver bell in his hand rang once, bright and clear. The sound washed over the court, and for the first time, Riven did not flinch. Elowen touched his hair gently. "You were never cursed," she whispered. "You were the first one who heard the truth coming." Servants near the doors began to cry quietly. Wolves who had looked through Elowen for years now lowered their eyes, not because Lucian forced them, but because shame had finally found them. By sunset, Lord Aldrin's stolen laws were stripped from the council chamber. Seraphine was sent from court with her titles broken and her false claim erased. The Moon Archive was open to healers, historians, and servants alike, and the name Moonveil was carved back into the royal line where it had been burned away. That night, under the full moon, Elowen stood with Lucian on the western balcony of Moonveil Citadel. The kingdom stretched below them in silver rooftops, dark forests, and distant mountain fires. She wore no heavy crown yet, only her mother's belt tied around her wrist, and a cloak Lucian had placed over her shoulders when the wind grew sharp. "You changed my kingdom in one night," he said. Elowen looked at him.
"No."
"I only danced. You were the one who listened." For the first time since she had met him, Lucian smiled. It was small, almost wounded, and more dangerous to her heart than all his power. The mate bond glowed between them, warm but not demanding, a promise waiting to be lived rather than a fate forcing itself closed. Elowen leaned her head against his shoulder, and Lucian stood very still, as if being trusted was the greatest honor his crown had ever given him. Below them, every bell in Noctharrow began to ring for its new Luna Queen. But as the final note faded, the moonlight on the balcony floor shifted. The crescent mark on Elowen's wrist flashed once, then cast a shadow that did not belong to Noctharrow's crown. It formed a second throne beyond a range of black mountains, older than Lucian's kingdom, wrapped in thorns and winter stars. Lucian's hand tightened gently around hers. "Elowen," he said, his voice low. "Did your mother ever speak of another crown?" Elowen stared at the shadow, and deep inside her chest, her newly awakened wolf lifted its head toward a call from far beyond the border. "No," she whispered, "but I think it remembers me."